Hello and welcome to the IND podcast, brought to you by me, Dennis Dunicic. It's good to be back with you. And before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that we haven't been with you in quite some time. And that is due to technical difficulties, brought to you by Samsung. And once again, I want to remind all of you to subscribe to our channel. Subscribe to stay in the loop on the most relevant international and global affairs that are occurring today. Now that that's out of the way, let's get right into our main story, which is Afghanistan, and more specifically concerning the Taliban-led government and its ability to face the newest, most relevant threat to domestic security today, ISIS, or the Islamic State. Now, we're going to do this news podcast in two different branches. We're going to focus on two aspects of this conflict. Number one is the rivalry and history of the conflict between the Taliban and ISIS. This is not something new. It's not something that's occurring just now today. It's something that has been occurring over the last 6 years. And finally, we're going to focus on the end game, or how this is potentially going to play out, what both parties' goals are, and how they plan on achieving them. And finally, what's most important is we're going to try and answer the question, is the Taliban able to actually face this major threat? So let's begin with the rivalry or the history of this conflict. Now, as everyone knows, the Taliban recently took power in Afghanistan in 2021, this year, in August. And it has instituted a pretty strict government, though it has been willing to show that it's prepared to cooperate on the international level. And this is because it needs international foreign aid, it wants to be a part of the global community, and it wants to be a functioning country. Now, it's facing a new and major threat, which is ISIS. ISIS is a terrorist organization that has existed since 1999, primarily at that time as a faction of Al-Qaeda. Eventually, ISIS would branch off of Al-Qaeda and create its own major terrorist organization with cells all over the world. Today, ISIS is the most major and most threatening Islamic terrorist organization that exists today. Now, ISIS has been present in Afghanistan since 2015, grabbing a foothold and introducing a deputy chief in Afghanistan who was actually a former Talibani commander. Now, when the Taliban arrived in Afghanistan, it was able to find supporters and members, primarily from Afghanistani militants, Pakistani militants, and Salafists. And Salafism is just a form of an interpretation of jihadist Islamic law. Now, ISIS was active in Afghanistan from 2015 until the general fall of ISIS in 2017. Keep in mind, during this period, ISIS held a significant amount of territory between Iraq and Syria, running what was essentially a de facto quasi-state that was not internationally recognized, but in all essence was a functioning country. And they had branches all over the world. One of the countries that they had a branch in was Afghanistan. And they operated committing terrorist attacks, gaining territory, and gaining influence in Afghanistan during the war that was occurring between the Taliban and the US-backed coalition and the Afghani government at the time. Now, after the fall of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, ISIS in Afghanistan would also fall. And the reasons for this is many members, quite simply over the years, left ISIS. They felt that ISIS was too brutal, was too oppressive, was too extremist in their beliefs and the way that it carried them out. ISIS very publicly committed an extensive amount of barbaric brutalities, beheadings, rapes, mutilations, things that are just too terrible to go into on a YouTube podcast. So I'm going to let your imagination run free there. But they were monstrous, globally speaking. And these people would leave ISIS and they were losing numbers. In addition to this, the Taliban were fighting ISIS, the US-backed coalition was fighting ISIS, and the Taliban was making military gains and eradicating terrorist cells of ISIS in Afghanistan. Now, finally, what was really extensive and effective against IS in Afghanistan were United States airstrikes, which pretty much were the nail in the coffin for the terrorist organization or the cell in Afghanistan. It completely made them irrelevant, and the last few members that it had left. Now, as the United States would begin to withdraw and lose interest in Afghanistan, and following the US-Afghan accords that occurred in 2020, ISIS would find a resurgence in the country. It would begin to gain new members, again, primarily being Afghan and Pakistani militants, but a good number of them being former members of the Taliban, which are completely disingenuous or disenfranchised by the group following its compromise or accords with the United States. And this story is relevant today because this past weekend, more specifically this Friday, in the northern Kunduz province of Afghanistan, a terrorist attack, a bombing occurred in a mosque, primarily Shiite, which is a minority belief group of the Islamic faith in Afghanistan, which killed 46 or 47 worshippers in the mosque. In addition to this, during the US withdrawal, on August 15th, an IS bombing would occur right outside of the airport as Western evacuations were occurring. This bombing would kill 169 Afghanis and 13 United States service members. So obviously, despite their defeat, which occurred in 2017, the Taliban have resurged as a relevant threat in Afghanistan. Now, a lot of people think, oh, the Taliban are Islamic fundamentalists and ISIS are Islamic fundamentalists. Why don't they get along? Why don't they work with each other and be terrorists together? You know, the reality is not such. Number one, there has to be some similarities established between the groups, or at least acknowledged. It is true that ISIS has carried out, and this is very notorious, and it's pretty much what they're mostly known for, a massive amount of brutal terrorist attacks, primarily suicide bombings. In addition to this, the Taliban have also carried out suicide bombings and different terrorist tactics, though they have stopped doing such in recent years, trying to be a more acceptable political force and now a governing entity of Afghanistan. So the Taliban has not been as keen to commit acts of terrorism as ISIS has been. So there is a difference there. Another similarity between the groups is they both believe in and they institute very strong fundamentalist and extremist interpretations of Islamic law. However, in terms of executing this law and executing punishments to people that break these laws, ISIS has been much more brutal. Yes, the Taliban do things like public whippings and public cutting off people's hands for things like theft. However, ISIS has been much more brutal in its execution of these laws, most notably doing public beheadings or even posting them on the internet, which has been shocking to the world and actually caused a significant amount of people to leave the ISIS's ranks in Afghanistan and worldwide. Now, what is the key difference between ISIS and the Taliban? The key difference is both sides do believe in Islamic fundamentalism. However, the Taliban believes in Islamic fundamentalism as a tool to achieve Afghanistani national independence. And what I mean by independence is independence from a foreign occupation and from foreign influence and meddling. Their main goal is a free and independent Afghanistan. Their tool for this is the Islamic faith, more specifically Islamic fundamentalism. The Taliban have no international or imperialistic ambitions or goals or a need to do any of this. They don't want to. What the Islamic State purports and what is their main ideology is Islamic fundamentalism on a global scale. They purport themselves, and the basis of their ideology is that IS, their organization, is a caliphate for Muslims all over the world, and every Muslim in the world should support them according to their belief. Whether the Muslims are in Afghanistan, whether the Muslims are in the United States, whether the Muslims are in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it doesn't matter. They should support the caliphate of the IS. They do not believe in national borders. They do not believe in national independence. They only believe in Islam, period. And things such as nationalism or a country or sovereignty are irrelevant in their view in the eyes of Allah. And that has been the major difference between, the major ideological difference between the Taliban and ISIS. And in addition to this, ISIS and many other extremist Islamic organizations, very few people, no mainstream normal Muslim supports ISIS. Not a single one. Not a single one supports them. Very few terrorist organizations support ISIS. And the only ones that do are organizations such as Boko Haram, which believe in a global Islamic caliphate. Those that believe in an Islamic society or an Islamic country, such as, for example, Hamas or Hezbollah or the Taliban, do not agree with ISIS and have fundamentally and historically fought them. And the Taliban has historically fought ISIS since its inception in Afghanistan since 2015. And very effectively, the Taliban have shown that they're able to outroot and get rid of these terrorist cells. Simply root them out and take them out. The Taliban have been extremely effective at this. Which brings us into the second part of this podcast, which is the end game. How is this conflict going to play out? As mentioned before, many terrorist attacks have already occurred in Afghanistan following the United States withdrawal on August 31st of this year. And these terrorist attacks are beginning to gain in casualties, and outside of terrorist attacks and suicide bombings, what has become an almost daily occurrence are Islamic State attacks on Taliban military targets, which are pretty much more than just a thorn in the side of the Taliban. In addition to this, ISIS has began to gain traction in Afghanistan, gaining some support from the local population who believe that the Taliban fundamentally is not able to give them security and peace. And more importantly, the Taliban has been able to poach and steal key Talibani leaders, commanders, and members to come and join their ranks. And the reason that these Talibani members are doing this, leaving the Taliban and joining ISIS, is because the Taliban, while they have instituted a very strict government that is not inclusive, it has shown that it is willing to cooperate with the international community, which hurts the Taliban's most fundamental aspect of its entire existence. The Taliban in Afghanistan and pretty much world over are viewed as these mujahideen freedom fighters that have fought for the independence of Afghanistan and have always fought against foreign meddling and influence. But now, when they are willing to go and have negotiations with countries like the United States, and there were talks, diplomatic talks, between the US and Taliban leaders this past week, with the European Union, with NATO, with the United Nations, it shows that maybe they weren't always this freedom fighter. They're not the mujahideen anymore. They want to allow foreign influence to come into Afghanistan. And many Afghanis feel disenchanted by this. They feel disenfranchised by this. And they have fled and joined the ranks of ISIS because they feel that ISIS is going to provide them with this actual independence and this global Islamic caliphate, that the only people that the Afghanis are going to answer to is going to have to be Allah. Now, the reality is that the Taliban controls the vast majority of territory in Afghanistan. ISIS is not as organized as it was before. It does not have the military, economic, financial, or whatever logistical, whatever resources that it did before. Now, the Taliban is not exactly running a country that is full of wealth and abundance, but they have significantly more resources than ISIS, which actually brings us to a very interesting situation where the Taliban are fighting themselves, having to fight another asymmetric war, except this time they aren't the insurgents. They're the fucking government. They're on the other side. The Taliban are experts at asymmetric warfare, at guerrilla warfare, at being insurgents. But now they have to fight the guerrillas. They have to fight the insurgents as the government, which is actually, in one sense, beneficial to the Taliban because they understand the tactics that are going to be used by ISIS in this conflict. But on the other hand, is detrimental because the tactics that the Taliban have used before, such as suicide bombings or targeted killings, assassinations, mass imprisonment, simply cannot be conducted anymore. If the Taliban government is doing this, a lot of countries in the West are not going to want to cooperate or work with Afghanistan. So the Taliban fundamentally has to learn how to fight a different form of warfare against the form of warfare they've been fighting for the last 20 years. And if you want to count the Mujahideen, which fought the Soviet Union in the 80s for the last 30 plus years, it's a completely shoes on the other foot kind of situation, if you will. Now, in addition to this, ISIS is gaining traction with its member base. It's fighting a new type of war against the Taliban and Afghanistan. The United States is no longer present in the country. There is no more US support. So when ISIS was previously active in Afghanistan from 2015 to 2017, three main things eliminated it. A lot of its member base simply left the organization because it felt that they were too brutal. The Taliban were making military gains on ISIS territory. And finally, United States airstrikes took them out. Now, the United States in this previous week, where they had diplomatic talks with the Taliban, offered to provide military support for the Taliban, to provide them with assistance and aerial defense against ISIS targets. The Taliban refused this support, and primarily for two reasons. Number one being that the Taliban, after fighting the United States, fighting for 20 years to remove this occupying force, simply cannot accept this occupying force to come back in and provide it with military support. It would completely ruin whatever crumb they have left of their Mujahideen freedom fighter image. And finally, many people feel that airstrikes are not an effective tool of fighting terrorism. Now keep in mind, ISIS historically has been like a cockroach. And I personally do try to, in all of my reports, be as extremely unbiased and objective as I can. I try to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and show both sides of the story. But there are no two sides to show when it comes to ISIS. This is a simple black and white issue. These people are fucking monsters. They're not people, they're cockroaches. And why I use the word cockroaches is because they never go away. They don't need money. They don't need massive military equipment to be successful. All they need is a membership base. And as long as they're able to recruit members, they will always be powerful. And ISIS is incredibly good at getting new members. They're experts at propaganda, and they're experts at these kind of backdoor tribal talks to have tribes join their ranks and to steal members from other extremist organizations. United States airstrikes have historically shown to create more terrorists than they kill. If one terrorist is hiding in a neighborhood and that neighborhood has 300 innocent people, we can drop a bomb in that neighborhood and we're going to kill that terrorist leader and he's gone. But we've killed at least 100 other innocent people who have fathers, sons, daughters, families, who are now going to be supporting, if not fighting, for ISIS. So the Taliban have decided to face this threat on their own, which brings us to the last part of this podcast. Are the Taliban going to be able to meet this threat of ISIS in its country? Many people feel that they're not going to be able to. Keep in mind, Afghanistan is still an economically very poor country. The current government is not as militarily well equipped as the previous United States-backed government was, and they do not know how to fight on the other side of asymmetric warfare. It's a completely different game for the Taliban. But I actually do believe the Taliban can meet this threat simply because historically they have shown that they are able to. They have successfully met every terrorist cell that is related to ISIS that has shown up in the territories which they have controlled, correct? And following up on why this story is important today, the catalyst for this entire show, this podcast today, was the terrorist attack that occurred on Friday in Kunduz that killed 47 worshippers in a Shiite mosque. The Taliban actually responded very appropriately to this. Immediately after this bombing, that being Talibani special forces, arrived on the scene. The provincial police chief immediately stated that they're going to provide protection for their minority brothers and all of their brothers and sisters in Afghanistan, and that they're going to meet this threat. Investigations have already begun leading to the arrest of the people that carried out this attack. They have already responded effectively, which is good. It shows that the Taliban is ready to face this threat. And the threat isn't that big right now. Now keep in mind, ISIS is not what it used to be. This is not the Islamic State that existed 6 years ago, which was publicly beheading people and posting it on YouTube and controlling a significant amount of territory in the Middle East. Far from it. This is a very disorganized group of extremists who are trying to organize and gain more support, but they still do not have it. They do not have territory, and they do not have the ability, at least as of now, and they will not for a very long time, have the ability or capability to capture or control a large or even relevant amount of Afghanistani land or territory. Right now, the goal of ISIS is much more slow and much more methodical. What they're doing is significantly more targeted. They're carrying out terrorist attacks. And the reason for these terrorist attacks is to show the Afghanistani people that the Taliban government cannot provide them with any sense of security or peace. In addition to this, ISIS has been carrying out a number of assassinations, and this is targeted to create power struggles amongst the ranks of the Taliban or to just create general chaos. And finally, they've been creating a lot of jailbreaks, getting people out of jail. Additionally, this is to create more chaos and to decrease the sense of security that Afghans feel, but also to free people from jails and bring them into their ranks. Again, as I stated, the most important aspect for ISIS is to maintain its membership base and to grow it. If the Taliban can meet that, if they can prevent ISIS from growing and from gaining any form of popularity on the mainstream level, this threat can actually be met. And the Taliban has very confidently stated that ISIS, or the Islamic State in Afghanistan, is a fringe group that has no mainstream appeal. And that is true as of now. So tell me what you think. I've given you my opinion. I want to see what you think. Let me know in the comments below how you think the situation is going to look like. Do you believe the Taliban can meet this threat, or do you think that the international community is going to have to provide them with logistical military support? Or is this problem going to be solved completely domestically? Once again, I want to remind you guys to subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop. It's been a while. I'm a little sloppy today. I'm out of practice. Keep in mind, everything we do is live. I do not have a teleprompter, but we're getting back on track, and that's it. See you tomorrow.